The flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror made my stomach drop. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I knew exactly who had called them. I pulled my truck over to the side of the road, watching as Officer Martinez stepped out of his patrol car, his breath visible in the cold Montana air. It was January, prime snowmobile season, and I had just finished an afternoon ride on the trail that ran through my property in Whitefish, a small mountain town where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Afternoon, Marcus," Officer Martinez said, walking up to my window with a tired expression. "Got a call about a snowmobile trespassing on private property belonging to the Pinewood Ridge HOA. I let out a long breath, my hands gripping the steering wheel. "Let me guess. Brenda Patterson called it in," Martinez nodded, pulling out his notepad. "How'd you know?" "Because this is the third time this month she's called the cops on me for using my own property," I said, feeling the frustration building in my chest. "That trail she's talking about, it runs right through the middle of my land. Has been mine since I bought this place 4 years ago." The officer looked down at his notes, then back at me. "She claims the trail is part of the HOA common area and that you're violating their bylaws by using it without permission." I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out a folder I had started keeping there specifically for situations like this. Inside were copies of my property survey, the deed to my land, and a map clearly showing the boundaries. "Here. This shows that the trail is entirely on my property. The HOA boundary ends 50 feet east of where the trail runs." Martinez took the documents and studied them under his flashlight, the winter sun already starting to set behind the mountains. After a few minutes, he handed them back to me. "This looks pretty clear, Marcus. The trail is definitely on your land." "I know it is," I said, "but Brenda and her HOA board refuse to accept it. They think because their fancy neighborhood backs up to my property, they have some kind of authority over what I do with my land." The officer sighed, closing his notepad. "I'll go have a talk with Mrs. Patterson and explain the situation. You're free to go, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience." "Thanks, Martinez. I appreciate you checking it out properly instead of just taking her word for it." As I drove away, I could see the cluster of houses that made up Pinewood Ridge in my rearview mirror. The HOA had been a thorn in my side since the day the development was completed 2 years ago. Before that, my 100-acre property had been surrounded by nothing but forest and mountains. Now, 20 McMansions sat on what used to be pristine wilderness, and the people who lived there seemed to think their HOA rules extended beyond their own property lines. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. It was my buddy Derek from town. "Hey man, saw the cop car following you down Mountain View Road. Everything okay?" "Yeah, just Brenda being Brenda again," I said, climbing out of my truck. "She called the cops because I was snowmobiling on my own trail," Derek laughed. "That woman has way too much time on her hands." "Did Martinez sort it out?" "He did, but I have a feeling this isn't over. Brenda doesn't back down easily." "No, she doesn't," Derek agreed. "Listen, I'm at the Grizzly Bar with some guys if you want to come blow off some steam." "Thanks, but I'm going to stay in tonight. I need to figure out how to handle this HOA situation before it gets even more out of hand." After I hung up, I went inside my cabin and started a fire in the wood stove. The place was simple but comfortable, a 2-bedroom log home I had built mostly myself after buying the land. It had taken me 2 years of weekends and vacation days to complete, but it was exactly what I wanted. A place away from the chaos of my job as a civil engineer in Kalispell. Somewhere I could enjoy the outdoors and have some peace and quiet. The irony wasn't lost on me that the HOA had destroyed that peace and quiet. I made myself dinner and sat down at my computer to do some research. If Brenda was going to keep harassing me about the trail, I needed to understand my rights better. Montana property law was pretty straightforward when it came to land ownership. If the trail was on my property, which it clearly was, then I had every right to use it however I wanted. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my land, regardless of what their bylaws said. The next morning, I was woken up at 7:30 by loud knocking on my front door. I stumbled out of bed, still in my sweatpants and t-shirt, and opened it to find Brenda Patterson standing on my porch with two other women I recognized from the HOA board. Brenda was exactly what you'd picture when someone says the word Karen. She was in her mid-50s with a blonde bob haircut that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Designer sunglasses pushed up on her head despite the overcast sky, and a permanent expression of disapproval on her face. She wore a puffy white jacket that probably cost $1,000 and held a leather portfolio under one arm. "Mr. Parker," she said, her voice clipped and formal, "we need to discuss your repeated violations of our community standards." I rubbed my eyes, trying to wake up. "Brenda, you don't have community standards for my property. I'm not part of your HOA. Your property borders our community, which means your actions directly affect our property values and quality of life," she said, not missing a beat. "We've received multiple complaints from residents about noise from your snowmobile, and you're using a trail that we maintain." "You don't maintain anything on my property," I said, feeling my patience wearing thin. "That trail is entirely on my land. I have the surveys to prove it." One of the other women, a brunette named Susan who served as the HOA treasurer, spoke up. "We had our own survey done, and it shows that the trail is actually on HOA common land." I stared at her. "You had your own survey done? When?" Brenda pulled a document out of her portfolio and tried to hand it to me. "Last week. This clearly shows that you've been trespassing on our property." I didn't take the paper. "That's impossible. I have a certified survey from when I bought this place, and I had it updated last year by a licensed surveyor. The trail is on my property." "Well, our surveyor says differently," Brenda said, her voice getting sharper. "And until this is resolved, we're demanding that you cease all use of the trail immediately." "You can demand whatever you want," I said, "but I'm not stopping. This is my land, and I'll use it however I see fit." Brenda's face turned red. "If you continue this behavior, we'll have no choice but to take legal action against you." "Go ahead," I said. "I'll see you in court with my surveys and my deed. Now get off my porch." The three women turned and walked back to Brenda's Mercedes SUV, and I watched them drive away before closing the door. This was escalating faster than I had expected. A fake survey. That was a new low, even for Brenda. I called my surveyor, a guy named Tom Hendricks who had been doing land surveys in northwest Montana for 30 years. He answered on the third ring. "Tom, it's Marcus Parker. I need to ask you something. Is there any way someone could get a legitimate survey that contradicts yours?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "Not if my survey was done correctly, which it was." "Why? Someone claiming your boundaries are different. The HOA next door is saying they had a survey done that shows the trail on my property is actually on their land." Tom snorted. "That's bull. I surveyed that property twice, once when you bought it and again last spring when you asked me to verify the boundaries. The trail is definitely on your land, at least 300 feet from their property line. Who did they supposedly hire? I don't know. They didn't say. Get me a copy of their survey and I'll take a look at it. If someone's making up fake surveys, that's a serious problem. That surveyor could lose their license. I'll see what I can do. Thanks, Tom." After I hung up, I got dressed and decided to drive into town to talk to a lawyer. This situation was clearly not going to resolve itself, and I wanted to be prepared if the HOA actually followed through on their threat to sue me. The law office of Patricia Grant was located in a renovated house on Main Street in Whitefish. Patricia was in her 60s, a no-nonsense attorney who had practiced property law in Montana her entire career. I had used her services when I bought my land, and she had been helpful and straightforward. Her secretary showed me into her office, where Patricia sat behind a large oak desk covered in files and legal books. "Marcus, good to see you," she said, gesturing for me to sit down. "What brings you in today?" I explained the situation with the HOA, from the repeated complaints to the fake survey they claimed to have. Patricia listened carefully, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "You have copies of your survey and deed with you?" she asked when I finished. I handed her the folder from my truck. She reviewed the documents, nodding as she read. "This is pretty straightforward," she said. "The trail is clearly on your property. The HOA has no legal standing to restrict your use of your own land." "They're threatening to sue me," I said. Patricia leaned back in her chair. "Let them. They'll lose. But I'm more concerned about this survey they claim to have. If they're presenting false documents, that could be fraud." "That's what I was thinking. My surveyor said he'd take a look at it if I can get a copy." "Good idea," Patricia said. "In the meantime, I'm going to draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA, telling them to stop harassing you and making false claims about your property. If they continue, we can pursue legal action against them for harassment." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked. "The letter will be $500. If this goes to court, we're looking at a few thousand minimum, but I'm confident we'd win and could potentially recover attorney fees from them." I nodded. "Do it. I'm tired of dealing with these people." Patricia drafted the letter while I waited, printed it out, and had it ready to mail that afternoon. I felt a little better leaving her office, knowing I had a lawyer backing me up. Over the next few days, things were quiet. I went to work, came home, and enjoyed some evening snowmobile rides on my trail. The weather was perfect, with fresh powder and clear skies. I tried not to think about the HOA drama and just appreciate the winter beauty of Montana. Then, on Friday evening, I came home to find a wooden barrier erected across my trail. It was a simple structure, just 2 posts with a horizontal board nailed between them, but it completely blocked the path. A sign hung from the board that read, "Private Property, No Trespassing, Pinewood Ridge HOA." I sat on my snowmobile, staring at the barrier in disbelief. They had actually come onto my property and built a blockade on my trail. I pulled out my phone and called Officer Martinez. "Martinez, it's Marcus Parker. The HOA just erected a barrier on my trail. They're physically blocking me from using my own property." "Are you sure they're the ones who did it?" he asked. "Who else would it be?" "There's a sign with their HOA name on it," Martinez sighed. "I'll send someone out to document it. Don't remove the barrier yourself. We need to handle this properly." A deputy arrived about 20 minutes later and took photos of the barrier and the sign. He also took my statement about coming home and finding it there. "This is pretty clearly on your property based on what Officer Martinez told me about the surveys," the deputy said. "But since you didn't see them build it, we can't prove who did it." "The sign has their name on it," I pointed out. "I know, but anyone could have put up that sign. We need more evidence to charge anyone with trespassing or vandalism." After the deputy left, I called Patricia Grant. She was furious when I told her what happened. "That's destruction of property at minimum, possibly criminal trespassing," she said. "Take lots of photos and don't touch the barrier. I'm going to file for a temporary restraining order against the HOA board members on Monday morning. That weekend was miserable. Every time I looked out my back window, I could see that barrier on my trail, a physical manifestation of the HOA's belief that they could control my property. I spent Saturday installing a trail camera near the barrier, positioning it to capture anyone who came near it. On Sunday afternoon, my camera caught something. I was inside making lunch when I got an alert on my phone that the camera had detected motion. I pulled up the video feed and watched as Brenda Patterson and two men I didn't recognize walked up to the barrier. One of the men was carrying surveying equipment. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside, walking the quarter-mile through the snow to where they were standing. As I approached, I could hear Brenda talking. "See, this marker right here shows the HOA property line," she was saying, pointing at something on the ground. "That's interesting," I said loudly, making all three of them jump. "Because my survey shows the property line is 300 feet that way." Brenda spun around, her face flushing. "Mr. Parker, you're trespassing on HOA property." "No, Brenda, you're trespassing on my property, and I have video of you doing it." I held up my phone, showing them the trail camera alert. One of the men, who was wearing a jacket with Mountain Survey Services embroidered on it, looked uncomfortable. "Madam, are you sure about these boundaries? This area doesn't match the property description you gave me." Brenda shot him an angry look. "I'm sure." "Mr. Parker is trying to intimidate us." "I'm not intimidating anyone," I said. "I'm standing on my own property, which is more than I can say for the three of you. I suggest you leave before I call the police again." The surveyor looked between me and Brenda, clearly uncertain. "I think I need to verify these boundaries before I continue this work." "That won't be necessary," Brenda snapped. "We hired you to do a job." "I'm not going to certify incorrect information," the man said firmly. "If there's a dispute about property lines, that needs to be resolved before I submit any survey." He packed up his equipment and walked away, leaving Brenda and the other man standing there. The second man, who I assumed was also from the HOA board, leaned in and whispered something to Brenda. She nodded stiffly. "This isn't over, Mr. Parker," she said. "You're right about that," I replied. "My lawyer is filing for a restraining order against you and the rest of the board tomorrow morning. Stay off my property." They left, and I checked the barrier to make sure they hadn't tampered with anything. I also downloaded all the video from my trail camera to use as evidence. Monday morning, Patricia filed for the temporary restraining order as promised. The hearing was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. In the meantime, I received a certified letter from the Pinewood Ridge HOA's attorney. It was a formal demand that I cease all use of HOA Trail 7 and remove any personal property from HOA common areas within 5 business days, or face legal action. I forwarded the letter to Patricia, who called me an hour later laughing. "This is the most ridiculous legal threat I've seen in years," she said. "They have absolutely no case. Their attorney is either incompetent or wasn't given accurate information by the HOA board. What do I do about it?" I asked. "Nothing. Ignore it. We'll address it at the hearing on Wednesday." The hearing took place in the Flathead County Courthouse. Judge Raymond Kowalski presided, a stern-looking man in his 70s who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense in his courtroom. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Patricia, while Brenda and 3 other HOA board members sat at the defendant's table with their attorney, a young guy in an expensive suit who looked fresh out of law school. Patricia presented our case first, submitting my property survey, deed, and photos of the barrier. She also played the video from my trail camera showing Brenda and the others on my property. "Your Honor, This is a clear case of harassment and trespassing, Patricia said. Mr. Parker owns the property in question, as evidenced by his deed and certified survey. The defendants have repeatedly called law enforcement with false complaints, erected an illegal barrier on his land, and are now threatening legal action based on fabricated claims. We're asking for a temporary restraining order to keep them off his property while we pursue charges for criminal trespassing and vandalism. The HOA's attorney stood up, looking nervous. Your Honor, my clients believe in good faith that the trail in question is part of their HOA common area. They commissioned a survey that supported this belief. Judge Kowalski looked up sharply. You have that survey with you? The attorney fumbled with his briefcase. I requested it from my clients, but they haven't provided it yet. So you're basing your defense on a survey you've never seen? The judge asked, his tone skeptical. My clients assured me that the survey exists and supports their claim. The judge turned to Brenda and the other board members. Mrs. Patterson, do you have this survey? Brenda stood up, looking defiant. We're still waiting for the final report from the surveyor. So you don't have a survey, the judge said flatly. We will have one soon, Brenda insisted. Judge Kowalski looked at the documents in front of him, then back at the defendants. Based on the evidence presented, Mr. Parker clearly owns the property in question. I'm granting the temporary restraining order. Mrs. Patterson and all members of the Pinewood Ridge HOA board are prohibited from entering Mr. Parker's property or contacting him directly. Any further communication must go through attorneys. Brenda's face went pale. But Your Honor, he's destroying our property values by— That's enough, Mrs. Patterson, the judge interrupted. What Mr. Parker does on his own land is his business, not yours. This hearing is adjourned. As we left the courtroom, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Finally, someone with authority had confirmed what I'd been saying all along. The trail was mine. Patricia and I celebrated with lunch at a local restaurant. That went better than I expected, she said. Usually these cases drag on for weeks. So what happens now? I asked. The restraining order is in effect immediately. If they violate it, they can be charged with contempt of court. I'll also start working on filing charges for the trespassing and vandalism. And we should consider a civil suit for harassment and legal fees. I just want them to leave me alone, I said. I understand, but you need to send a message that this behavior has consequences. Otherwise, they might try something else down the road. I agreed, and Patricia said she'd start working on the next steps. When I got home that afternoon, I removed the barrier from my trail. I was legally allowed to do it now, and it felt good to clear the path. I loaded up my snowmobile and took a long ride through the backcountry, enjoying the freedom of my own land without looking over my shoulder for HOA busybodies. But my peace didn't last long. Thursday morning, I woke up to find my mailbox had been smashed. It was completely destroyed, lying in pieces on the side of the road. I immediately suspected the HOA, but I had no proof. I called the sheriff's office and filed a report, then installed another camera pointing at the road where my mailbox stood. I also put up a temporary mailbox while I figured out a more permanent solution. That evening, I got a call from Derek. Hey man, I heard some interesting gossip at the hardware store today. What's that? I asked. Apparently Brenda Patterson is telling everyone in town that you threatened her in court yesterday. I felt my blood pressure rise. That's a complete lie. I didn't even speak to her. I know, but she's spreading it around. Just thought you should know. After I hung up, I called Patricia and told her about the rumors. She made a note of it and said we could address it if needed. Friday brought more problems. I received a notice from Flathead County Code Enforcement stating that I was in violation of county noise ordinances due to complaints about snowmobile noise. The notice said I needed to restrict snowmobile use to certain hours or face fines. I knew exactly who had filed the complaints. I called the county office and explained the situation, including the restraining order against the HOA. The code enforcement officer, a woman named Jennifer, was sympathetic. "I have to investigate every complaint we receive," she said. "But if you're operating during legal hours and on your own property, there's not much we can do. I'll note the restraining order in your file and mark this complaint as unfounded. Thanks. I appreciate you actually looking into it instead of just taking their word." "That's my job," she said. "But I'd recommend keeping a log of when you use your snowmobile, just in case more complaints come in." I started keeping a detailed log, noting the date, time, and duration of every ride I took. I also made sure to only ride during reasonable hours, even though I was legally allowed to ride much later into the evening. The following week, I was served with papers for a lawsuit. The Pinewood Ridge HOA was suing me for property damage, claiming that my snowmobile had destroyed vegetation on their land and caused erosion that was affecting their property values. They were seeking $50,000 in damages. I took the papers straight to Patricia's office. She read through them, shaking her head. "This is completely frivolous," she said. "They're clearly trying to harass you into submission. We'll file a motion to dismiss based on the previous court ruling, and I'm also going to recommend we countersue for malicious prosecution." "How much is all this legal work costing me?" I asked, worried about the mounting bills. "We're up to about $3,000 so far," Patricia said. "But if we win the countersuit, we can recover all of it plus additional damages for harassment." I authorized her to move forward with the countersuit. I was tired of being on the defensive. It was time to push back. The next few weeks were relatively quiet on the HOA front. My motion to dismiss their lawsuit was granted, and Judge Kowalski was clearly annoyed that they had filed it in the first place. He warned their attorney that continued frivolous litigation could result in sanctions. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. In early March, I came home from work to find that someone had dumped trash all along my trail. There were bags of garbage, old furniture, and what looked like construction debris scattered across a 100-yard stretch. It was clearly intentional, placed in a way that made the trail impassable. I called the sheriff's office immediately, and this time they sent out a detective. Deputy Detective Walsh was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes who took the vandalism seriously. "This is the fourth incident you've reported involving possible HOA harassment," she said, walking along the trail and taking photos. "That's enough to establish a pattern. I'm going to interview the HOA board members and see if anyone admits to anything or if we can find evidence linking them to this." "I have trail cameras set up," I said. "Let me check if they caught anything." We walked back to my cabin and I pulled up the camera footage on my computer. The dump had happened around 2 in the morning and the cameras had caught it. Unfortunately, the people dumping the trash wore ski masks and dark clothing, making identification impossible. But the video did show 2 people, and one of them appeared to be a woman based on her build and movements. "This is good evidence that it was intentional," Detective Walsh said. "But we need more to charge anyone specific. I'll show this to the board members and see if anyone's reaction gives us something to work with." She left, and I spent the rest of the evening cleaning up the trash. It took me 4 hours and multiple trips with my ATV and trailer to haul everything to the dump. I was exhausted and angry by the time I finished. The next day, Detective Walsh called me with an update. I interviewed all 5 board members. They all denied any involvement but Mrs. Patterson's reaction was interesting. She seemed nervous and kept asking if we had video of who did it. "Did you tell her we did?" I asked. I showed her the video but told her we couldn't identify anyone from it. She seemed relieved, which struck me as odd. Why would she be relieved if she wasn't involved? So, what happens now? I'm going to keep digging. I'm also going to ask around and see if anyone noticed suspicious activity that night. Someone might have seen the vehicle they used to haul all that trash. 2 days later, Detective Walsh called me again. I got a hit. A resident of Pinewood Ridge named Daniel Edwards contacted me. He said he saw Mrs. Patterson and another board member, Stephen Carlson, loading trash bags into a pickup truck around 1 in the morning on the night of the dumping. He thought it was weird but didn't think much of it at the time. When I showed him the video, he confirmed that the timing matched. "Is that enough to charge them?" I asked. "It's enough for me to question them again, and if they admit to it or if their stories don't match up, yes. I'm bringing them both in this afternoon." I waited anxiously for news. Around 6 that evening, Detective Walsh called me back. "Stephen Carlson cracked," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. When I confronted him with the witness statement and the video, he admitted to dumping the trash. He said it was Brenda Patterson's idea, that she was trying to make your property unusable so you'd stop snowmobiling. "Are they being charged?" I asked. "Yes. Criminal trespassing, illegal dumping, and vandalism. Mrs. Patterson is denying everything, but Carlson's statement is pretty damning. They'll both be arraigned tomorrow." I felt a mix of vindication and disbelief. Brenda had actually committed crimes just to harass me over a snowmobile trail. The next day, the story hit the local news. "HOA president arrested for vandalism" was the headline in the Whitefish Pilot. The article detailed the months of harassment I'd endured and the charges against Brenda and Stephen. Public opinion quickly turned against the HOA, with many locals commenting online about similar experiences with overzealous HOA boards. Patricia called me after seeing the news. "This is actually good for our countersuit. The criminal charges strengthen our harassment case significantly. I'd recommend we increase our damages request to include emotional distress and punitive damages." "Whatever you think is best," I said. "I just want this to be over." Brenda and Stephen both pled not guilty at their arraignment, but the evidence against them was strong. Their trial was set for late May. In the meantime, the HOA held an emergency meeting and voted to remove both Brenda and Stephen from the board. The new president, a reasonable woman named Michelle Torres, reached out to Patricia to discuss a settlement. "They want to settle both the criminal case and the civil case," Patricia told me during a phone call. "They're offering to pay for all your legal fees, issue a formal apology, and pay $25,000 in damages. In exchange, you'd agree not to pursue additional civil action against the HOA or individual board members." "What about the criminal charges?" I asked. "Those are separate. The county prosecutor is handling those and they're moving forward regardless." "But the HOA is willing to cover Brenda and Stephen's restitution as part of the settlement." I thought about it. $25,000 would more than cover my legal fees and the time I'd spent dealing with all of this. And most importantly, it would mean the end of the harassment. "Tell them $35,000, and they have to acknowledge in writing that the trail is on my property and they have no claim to it." Patricia negotiated for a few days and came back with an agreement. $32,000, full acknowledgement of my property rights, and a written apology to be posted in the HOA newsletter and on their community website. I accepted the settlement. Brenda and Stephen's criminal trial happened in June. I attended as a witness, testifying about the months of harassment and the impact it had on my life. Stephen took a plea deal before the trial concluded, agreeing to community service, probation, and restitution. Brenda refused to plead out and was found guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced her to 90 days in jail, suspended pending completion of 200 hours of community service and 2 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution and court costs. As I watched her leave the courtroom, I felt no satisfaction in her downfall. The whole situation had been so unnecessary. If she had just accepted from the beginning that the trail was on my property and not hers to control, none of this would have happened. The settlement money came through in July. After paying Patricia's remaining fees, I had about $28,000 left. I used some of it to install a proper fence along the property line between my land and the HOA development, making it crystal clear where my property ended and theirs began. I also upgraded my trail, adding better markers and maintaining it more regularly. The new HOA board kept their distance. Michelle Torres sent me a polite email in August, asking if I'd be willing to attend a community meeting to discuss establishing a good neighbor relationship. I agreed, and the meeting was actually productive. Several residents apologized for Brenda's behavior and expressed interest in enjoying the outdoors the way I did. A few even asked if they could join me on snowmobile rides that winter, and I said yes, as long as they understood it was my property and my rules. By the time autumn arrived, the whole nightmare felt like a distant memory. I had my trail, my property rights were firmly established, and the harassment had stopped. I'd even made a few friends among the Pinewood Ridge residents who weren't part of Brenda's toxic inner circle. One afternoon in late September, I was working in my yard when a car pulled up. A woman in her 30s got out looking nervous. "Mr. Parker, my name is Deanna Emerson. I just moved into Pinewood Ridge and I wanted to introduce myself." "Nice to meet you," I said, shaking her hand. "Welcome to the neighborhood." "I heard about what happened with the previous HOA board," she said. "I wanted you to know that I'm on the board now and we're committed to being better neighbors. If you ever have any concerns, please let me know." "I appreciate that," I said. Honestly, things have been great since the new board took over. We chatted for a few minutes about the area and the upcoming winter season. As she left, I realized that the community around me had fundamentally changed. The toxic leadership that had made everyone miserable was gone, replaced by people who actually wanted to build positive relationships with their neighbors. That winter was the best I'd had since moving to Montana. I rode my snowmobile whenever I wanted, and several Pinewood Ridge residents joined me on various trips. We explored backcountry trails, enjoyed the mountain scenery, and built the kind of community that should have existed from the beginning. I saw Brenda once more in early December as she was leaving the courthouse after completing some paperwork related to her probation. She looked older, tired, and defeated. Our eyes met briefly and I nodded at her. She looked away and hurried to her car. I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband were selling their house and moving to Arizona. The Pinewood Ridge house sold in January for less than they'd paid for it, partly because potential buyers had heard about the HOA drama and were wary of the neighborhood. As for me, I kept living my life the way I always had. I worked my job in Kalispell, enjoyed my property, and appreciated the peace and freedom of Montana living. The whole experience had taught me important lessons about standing up for your rights and not backing down when someone tries to bully you into submission. Patricia and I stayed in touch, and she occasionally referred other clients to me who were dealing with similar HOA disputes. I was always happy to share my story and encourage them to fight back against unreasonable HOA demands. The fence I'd installed along the property line became a physical reminder of where my rights began and ended. I maintained it carefully, and it served its purpose of preventing any future boundary disputes. Some of the Pinewood Ridge residents planted flowers along their side of it, and I had to admit it looked nice. In March, a year after the trash dumping incident, Michelle Torres invited me to speak at an HOA meeting about property rights and being a good neighbor. I was hesitant at first, but she convinced me it would be helpful for the community. I stood in front of about 30 residents and shared my experience, from the first complaint about snowmobile noise to the eventual settlement and criminal trial. I emphasized that the root of all the problems had been a failure to respect property boundaries and a belief that HOA rules extended beyond HOA property. The lesson here is simple, I said. Know your boundaries, respect your neighbor's rights, and communicate instead of escalate. If Brenda had come to me at the beginning and said, "Hey, we're concerned about noise, can we talk about it?" instead of calling the cops, we could have worked something out. Maybe I would have adjusted my riding times, or maybe we would have agreed to disagree. But it never would have turned into criminal charges and lawsuits. The residents listened attentively, and several came up afterward to thank me for sharing. One older gentleman named Robert said, "You know, I was friends with Brenda before all this happened. She was always a bit controlling, but I never thought she'd go this far. I'm glad you stood your ground. Someone needed to." As spring turned to summer, I started a new project on my property. I built a small warming hut near the trail, a place where riders could stop, warm up, and enjoy a hot drink during winter rides. I made it clear that it was open to anyone who wanted to use it respectfully, including Pinewood Ridge residents. The hut became popular, and on weekends I'd often find groups of snowmobilers using it as a rest stop. I kept it stocked with firewood, hot chocolate mix, and a guest book where people could leave comments. Reading through the entries made me happy. People wrote about the beautiful scenery, the great trails, and how much they appreciated having a place to warm up in the backcountry. Derek and I also started leading guided snowmobile tours for tourists. Montana's winter tourism was growing, and there was demand for experienced guides who knew the terrain. The income was modest, but it was fun work and let me share my love of the outdoors with others. By the time the 2-year anniversary of the first police call rolled around, I could look back on the whole experience with perspective. Yes, it had been stressful and expensive. Yes, Brenda's harassment had made my life difficult for months. But it had also forced me to stand up for myself, to understand property law better, and to build relationships with neighbors I might never have talked to otherwise. The trail that had caused so much conflict became a source of community building. I hosted several charity rides that raised money for local causes, and Pinewood Ridge residents were among the most active participants. We raised $3,000 for the Whitefish Food Bank and another $2,000 for a scholarship fund for local high school students. In August, I received a letter from Stephen Carlson. He'd completed his community service and probation and wanted to apologize in person. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop in town. Stephen looked different than he had during the trial. He'd lost weight, and there was a weariness to him that hadn't been there before. "Marcus, I want you to know how sorry I am for everything that happened," he said, his voice sincere. "I let Brenda convince me that what we were doing was justified, but I knew deep down it was wrong. I should have stood up to her." "Why didn't you?" I asked. He sighed. Honestly, I was afraid of her. She had a way of making you feel like if you weren't with her, you were against her. And in a small HOA, that kind of social pressure is powerful, but that's no excuse. I made my own choices, and they were wrong. We talked for over an hour. Stephen told me about how the experience had affected his life, his marriage, and his standing in the community. He'd resigned from the HOA board, and he and his wife were in counseling to work through the stress of the legal proceedings. I learned a lot about myself through all this, he said. Mostly that I need to be stronger and stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. I appreciated his honesty and his willingness to take responsibility. We parted on good terms, and I genuinely hoped he'd learned from the experience. As autumn arrived again, bringing with it the promise of another winter season, I felt genuinely content with my life. The property dispute that had once dominated my thoughts was now just a story I told occasionally. A reminder of the importance of knowing your rights and standing firm when challenged unjustly. The trail through my property, the one that had caused so much conflict, was better maintained than ever. I'd added directional signs, cleared fallen trees, and even built a small bridge over a creek that had been tricky to cross during spring thaw. It had become one of the most popular recreational trails in the area, and I took pride in maintaining it. One evening in October, I was sitting on my back porch watching the sunset when I saw a family of deer crossing the trail. They moved gracefully through the fading light, completely undisturbed by the human developments nearby. It reminded me why I'd bought this property in the first place, why I'd fought so hard to protect my rights to use it as I saw fit. This was my home, my land, my trail. And no HOA, no matter how determined or unreasonable, was going to take that away from me. The phone rang inside and I went to answer it. It was Derek, calling to plan a snowmobile trip for opening day of the season. "You ready for another winter?" he asked. I looked out the window at my trail, at the mountains beyond, at the life I'd built and defended. "Yeah," I said, "I'm ready." And I was. Ready for whatever came next, confident in my rights, and grateful for the community I'd helped build from the ashes of conflict. The HOA had called the cops when my snowmachine crossed what they thought was their trail, but the officer had confirmed what I'd known all along. The trail was mine, and it always would be.